Thanks very much. So this is a very interdisciplinary subject. My primary research is in astrophysics, and as mentioned, I got into this as during a stint as a consultant working in this defense science study group with the Institute for Defense Analyses. It's a very interdisciplinary subject, which makes it challenging in interesting ways. And as you'll see, I hope to just convey some of the principles underlying this, and it will be a kind of conversation. So the first thing, closed TBI, what I talk will refer to as closed traumatic brain injury. This is brain injury without skull fracture. And the issue is what's going on and how to protect against this and where is it happening. So the two contexts, head impacts and blast overpressure. So head impacts, sports, military, blast overpressure, mainly military explosion. And the interdisciplinary nature starts out here with a little biology. So there's the brain. The brain is basically has the consistency of something like Jello and mayonnaise, in between Jello and mayonnaise, and it's embedded in cerebral spinal fluid. So it's suspended in fluid, and then the skull, of course, surrounds that. Uh, the so just keep that in mind. It sloshes around basically, and that's an important aspect of the mechanisms of injury. So in the brain, you see down here, there's white and gray matter. The interface between those two is particularly weak in terms of ability to shear and stress. Also, these bridging veins that go from the brain to the exterior here are also important sites of injury. Now, just brain cells, another little biology component here. Brain cells, basically two classes, neurons, which carry all the signals, do the processing, um, and glial cells, which are sort of like the support staff of the neurons, and they're presently understood to be approximately in equal numbers. This is about the same number as stars in the galaxy, um, and the scales are microns. So 4 to 100 microns. A micron is 10 to a millionth of a meter, and they can be very long. Um, and so this is just the general cellular, and there's different classes of these glial cells. They serve different supporting functions. But ultimately, damage to the brain is damage to components of these cells, either their synapses where they connect, stresses on the individual cells themselves, and another component, which I'll describe in a moment, which is the inability for brain, which is the mechanisms by which brain clear waste. So some head impact physics here. Uh, just rapid deceleration of the head upon an impact. So first, we'll consider impacts. Uh, Car crashes have been the dominant industry that has really studied. I say studied. It's really very empirical study of head impacts. Um, but the basic mechanism is that of injury is that you have rapid deceleration of the head upon impact, and the brain crashes into the impact site on the front of the skull, so in the inside of the skull, but the brain comes crashing in, and then it bounces back and rebounds. So that little area here, this brain is smushing up against the front of the skull, and then has this open cavity here. Fluid fills kind of behind there, and the brain, in a linear impact where you're just hitting the head linearly into the obstacle here, then the brain comes back and hits the back part. So you would get damage, primary damage on the front and on the back side of the brain. Um, and the impact energy is being converted into brain deformation energy if nothing else can absorb the energy of impact. So if the energy is dissipated in the brain rather than a skull or a helmet, then that's a source of tissue tearing and damage. Um, Understanding how those external forces correlate with internal tissue stress, and then how those internal stresses correlate with clinical symptoms is an active area of research. The injury will depend on the magnitude and the duration of the force, and the best metrics for these injuries are still under investigation. We'll come back to more of these themes as I proceed. And indeed, there are different classes of injury that are commonly referred to clinically: contusions, general bruising, and I point to the front and the coup and counter coup locations here of where the impact surface is here. Bridging veins between the brain and exterior here are places where the shear of the brain tissue as it comes away from the boundary can rip those veins, and then diffuse axonal injury. These are shear damage of the axons in the cells, and locations of white and gray matter linkage where they're particularly vulnerable to this shear stress. But importantly, the physical damage can be below the physical detectability, and these concussions, for example, are defined only by their clinical symptoms, not by their internal damage. And clinically, the concussions are determined clinically by a series of clinical um, metrics, cognitive, and observation in by a clinician. Um, Chronic traumatic encephalopathy is another insidious uh, uh, brain injury, and it comes from repeated impacts, very hard to identify in vivo, and the intensity of the hits which produces this, uh, individual hits are below concussion threshold, and here concussion threshold is just again defined clinically. So these hits, which could be, for example, amount to accelerations that are larger than 20, 30 times a gravitational acceleration, uh, repeated over time, for example, in football, have led to identification of uh, of of injury that shows up as in actually deceased players as a buildup of a certain kind of protein that inhibits waste removal. I will come back to that point again. Very important. Just the costs of traumatic brain injury, very costly on society. 60 billion a year treatment for civilian cases. Most are concussions. There are 300,000 sport and recreation concussions diagnosed each year, possibly 7 times more than that going undiagnosed. And there's an undetermined number of these subconcussive injuries that accumulate, and whose accumulated damage is hard to it's hard to assess a threshold for how much accumulated weak impacts lead to long-term problems. The military, before the Iraq war, approximately 3% of soldiers were identified with some kind of traumatic brain injury. These, again, from clinical symptoms. After 20% of all troops had traumatic brain injury. And this is related to blast explosions and IEDs. And that's where an important paradigm for protection question emerges. Um, how to protect the head against a blast explosion, and what are the consequences of that? Just to note, for concussions in sports, it's interesting that you might expect that football is the dominant statistic. So this is concussions per 100 athletic exposures in red. That's appearance in a game or practice. And then per 1,000 hours of play is another measure that have been used, and where the data were available, I put that here. Girls ice hockey is particularly vulnerable to concussions, which is interesting because there is no checking in women's or girls ice hockey. But that has been partly uh, attributed to a reason that there may be an increase in concussions because the hits come and its expectation is not quite there. But football is the worst. But even these are TBI that are detectable. So this is again concussions which have clinical symptoms that are measured. Uh, now, um, this more about this chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So this is the result of repeated subconcussive impacts um, and the mechanism, so it's been understood that after a long history of playing a sport or incurring boxing, for example, or football, um, players that have been deceased and who have allowed their brains to be examined show a buildup of so-called tau protein that presents normal connections to other cells. This protein is needed for the structural integrity of cells, but it builds up to excessively and then causes a dysfunction. Um, as we'll see here, this is an example just of this kind of thing. So a healthy brain tissue is outside of this region, and here is an example of the buildup of tau proteins. This is in an 18-year-old football player, and this is the example of what is being described. I'm describing here. Um, the 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 interesting connection is that it's linked now to the brain's waste removal system, and so this is worth going into a little bit. It's been understood now, and there's a lab actually at the University of Rochester here, Niedergaard et al., that has led the way on this. What ultimately emerging from a question of why do we sleep? So it turns out that brain waste removal occurs almost exclusively during sleep. So the rest of our body removes waste through the lymph system, uh, and during sleep, the brain cells shrink and they increase the interstitial space between cells by up to 60%. And this allows cerebral spinal fluid to flow freely into the brain cell gaps. And during deep sleep, there are coordinated pumping of fluid that seep through and essentially wash this brain tissue. The cerebral spinal fluid then flushes out the waste and carries it into the lymph system. Uh, and that is from the interior of the brain to the around the exterior through through the boundary. Where exactly the flow goes and the exact fluid dynamics there is ongoing activity, ongoing research, but the system clears these tau protein and other proteins, amyloid beta, that are associated with neurodegenerative
Yeah,
diseases. And based on this and the cells which mediate this transport to the lymph system are these glial cells that I mentioned, the sort of support cells to the neurons. And so this was deemed the glymphatic system. And it's basically could also be interpreted as an explanation for why we sleep, what the importance of sleep is, metabolic waste clearance of the brain. And what's
Eric.
also interesting is that uh, these neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's, Huntington's, Parkinson's, along with TBI, and along with sleep deprivation, uh, in which all seem to show over long exposures to these circumstances, the buildup of these kind of proteins, these proteinopathies, this pathological buildup of these tau proteins. So the point is that TBI, it's likely that the repetitive hits from subconcussive impacts over time is causing subtle damage to the brain cells and tissue that start to inhibit the ability for the brain to clear its waste. And that is
Yeah,
a
Eric.
long-term effect that,
Yeah, Eric, there's a quick
question.
question for you before you
Yeah,
get too far along on this.
sure.
Jim has a question. Jim Boyd, you want to ask it?
Yeah, so Eric, I was reacting to the slide you showed on injuries from sports,
Yeah.
both adult and youth sports, and I I'm wondering why soccer is so high on the list, and do you think it's from heading the ball?
Yes, there's some head-to-head collisions, probably the worst component of that. But there is heading the ball over a long period of so soccer players. So the concussions would not come from heading. This is concussions. This one, the concussions are basically, I mean, it's from heading and colliding with another player. This particular is for only the clinically detectable circumstance of TBI, which is a concussion. It is also the case that soccer players who have been deceased have been found to show this buildup of this tau protein, symptomatic of the subconcussive repetitive impacts. And that may, over the course, that is likely from heading the ball, possibly not from.
Mhm.
So that's yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
and then one other question. So ice hockey is pretty high on both lists. And up until about 20 years ago, players did not wear helmets, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
now they do. And so did that, take a big step toward improvement, or
I
have we
think
not seen much improvement?
no, I think well, I think it's not improved. So I don't think that I think with the helmets it's gotten better rather than worse. Uh so I don't know the statistics before helmets were required in hockey. I mean, they weren't required, as you say, and I don't actually know the statistics, but I am quite confident that given the same rules, given the checking rules and such, that the helmets have um, helped with this. So I mean, I think I think that's also the case. But also, there's also other issues with the helmets. I mean, getting a puck to the face, getting your teeth smashed, and even skull. I mean, that those kind of injuries stick to the head. Those are even more serious than just, sort of say mild concussions, I think. So but the padding is a relevant question there, and I'll come to that a little bit. Most helmets are designed traditionally, until recently, have really been designed for skull fracture. Um, because and actually that's in part because those injuries are visible. Um,
Okay.
right. So
Eric,
that segues nicely into this into this role of helmets. So uh, to, because historically the helmets have, as I say, been designed mainly for skull fracture. You can think in the military also, uh, for sure, designed for ballistic protection, and the subconcussive injury. So concussions are one thing, uh, but even the subconcussive injuries, there is a culture of, before these things, there's more sensitivity to a lot of these issues. The culture was sort of one of machismo, get out there, get back out in the field, get back out and play, a question of being weak. Uh, and so if you can't see the injury physically, the blurring of the distinction between some kind of psychological weakness versus a physical injury gets blurred. And this is an important aspect of this whole enterprise. So you need to reduce the energy absorbed by the brain. You need to reduce the head linear acceleration, forces mass times acceleration. You need to reduce the acceleration of the brain smashing into the skull, and therefore this is reducing the acceleration of the head. You also most of the so most of the work has gone into linear acceleration, but rotational acceleration, I think, is actually the most important. There is increasing evidence towards this as well, but it turns out that as your head is rotating and accelerating, the so-called shear modulus of tissue, brain tissue, that is the ability for it to be sheared and stretched, is much lower threshold than to be compressed. And so the bulk modulus, which is a measure of how much it compresses, essentially how effectively isotropic pressure can damage the tissue, is not as low as a shear stress. So that's important. Hard shells are ineffective without cushioning, as might be intuitive, because you need in the interior absolutely need a pads on a crumple zone, and you can start to see that what kind of pads do you need? It depends on the velocity of the impacts, and if you're incurring a sport that has different velocity of impacts, how do you design the pads exactly to optimize for different ranges of those impacts in velocity and acceleration? And one important point that I also would like to point out, tight fit is conceptually wrong. So there's a lot of traditional coaching and such, make sure your helmet fits tightly in a way this is really conceptually wrong. What you would like is the helmet shell to decouple from the cushioning in the interior, because then, for example, the rotation, imagine putting a spinning pot on your head would be very good for rotational acceleration mitigation, because the rotating pot would just spin around and round and round, and that doesn't go into torque your head. So a tight fit is actually conceptually wrong, and that's probably the most fundamental observable thing you can see about current helmets that is just wrong. I mean, so common helmets from the inside look here. So military helmets, football. So most of these are tight-fitting helmets. The thickness issues that go into the helmet design include the thickness of the pad, the material, the nature of the helmet shell, the and yeah, and I'll say some more about this, but so these pads, interestingly, when I was working in the military, so this is a combat helmet that's been the standard helmet up until recently. There's a new combat helmet coming in 2025. These pads are removable. The pads make a difference for impact. I will discuss blast as well, but they're very hot. So the soldiers were taking them out in the Iraq war. So, even little things like that for the actual, so you can design a helmet, but if the soldiers are going, it's uncomfortable, it's going to be a kind of an issue. So those are issues that are involved, detail in the helmet design. But this helmet has been banned. This helmet had the cushioning is a dynamic cushioning. It had little air pockets that had this interesting feature that for high impacts, the air doesn't release because there's a kind of turbulent that blocks the air from coming out of the hole. So it's like when you take a can and you make a small hole in it, the water doesn't come out, the liquid doesn't come out unless you put like another hole in it at a very high speed. So if you have very high impact, these were designed to have be more rigid for higher impacts and less rigid. So as you for a lower impact hit, they smoothly release the air. Anyway, this has been banned, but not because of that innovation, but because of the shell was cracking. The outer shell was damaged in recent helmet testing. So this is a helmet that does have rotational separation of the protective cell from the outer shell. So it does protect against rotational. So you can see at impact, the outer shell moves with respect to the inner head protection down here. This has been around for 10 years. It hasn't caught on. This particular helmet hasn't caught on. The principles are still floating around. These are kind of active evolution of the design, that the highest rated NFL helmet right now, and I'll describe a little bit how those are rated, is this helmet, this Visus Zero Trench Elite. Really, it has a crumple zone, so you can see the sort of crumple zone here, and it has a flexible outer shell. The outer shell is not rigid, it actually flexes, which is a partial uh, help for this rotational uh, component, but it's not it's still not really a huge paradigm shift. But the interior cushioning is more of a crumple zone. These are rather large helmets. Um, so there's the key is in the is really in is this, you know, having a cushioning and having this flexible outer shell, and this is not the final answer to any of these things. So all of the helmet testing, none of it protects against this chronic traumatic encephalopathy because those hits are too low on any of the metrics that I'll describe in a moment to show up in the testing thresholds. All the helmets protect against low-level hits. It's the accumulation of those low-level hits that causes damage. So the helmets are designed for protecting against high impact hits above at a threshold that's much higher than for which the sum of small accumulated hits would cause damage. The standard way helmets are treated are tested is a drop test. They're put on a this kind of rail in a head form with a spring for a neck kind of thing, and the drop form is free fall dropped from various heights here, smashes into the anvil, and these are fitted with accelerometers that can measure various different components of acceleration. They have the velocity, the acceleration, they calculate rotational, the other acceleration metrics that are in the sensors, and then are post-processed to analyze. Now, the data.
Okay, Eric,
Go, yeah,
I'm sorry. Juliet McComas has a question
yeah,
for you about honeycomb structure. And actually, that would be a question I would have too. So,
yeah.
Juliet, you want to ask it? Don't forget to unmute.
Sure, thank you. There's a CCM brand of hockey helmet that has featured a honeycomb compressible interior structure. It's much cooler to wear.
Yes.
Has that migrated into football and lacrosse helmet design?
Uh, Sorry that there was some feedback there, but yes, the honeycomb structure is very good, is good. That's a lot of it's coming from packing industry. There has been some cross. I'm sorry, there's some feedback here. But yeah, there's been some cross fertilization in this from the packing industry, which uses honeycomb structure to cushion packaging and that kind of stuff. Yes, it is very good. It depends. I mean, the honeycomb structure is very good. It also depends on what the honeycomb material is made of. But the principle is very good. This kind of crumple zone is very good. It may not, it may, as with any kind of cushioning, there is a question of, I mean, so it depends on what that material is made of, but also there's a question specific testing, like how it tests against different relative impact accelerations, different relative speeds. But the principle is very good. Per unit mass, the honeycomb design is likely to be a good one for basic cushioning. It itself doesn't so the rotational, what you would like in the honeycomb also is that it's not just a one directional cushioning. So what you would kind of like is to have the honeycomb cushioning stretch longitudinally. So if you twist, you'd like that honeycomb to link an inner head form with the outer shell, and have the honeycomb also like stretch somewhat elastically as you hit obliquely on the outer shell. And then if you hit directly radially, that honeycomb cushioning is generally very good. So I would say positive towards that uh, concept.
Yeah.
Now, what has been done here is that the sensors in these testing helmets are very good, and in fact, there have been players can be fitted with a whole system in games, measure in detail the head motion, head acceleration, etc., and then that data can be used in to identify metrics. So one kind of way in which you can come up with injury thresholds is you either you videotape and you look at the injury circumstances that occurred. This was one original way of doing this, and then you reproduce these in the collisions in the laboratory, and put sensors on the head, and then identify what levels of acceleration corresponded to circumstances where there was a clinical injury. So if these players got a concussion from this hit, this would be one of the hits that this would be analyzed. It would be simulated in an experiment, and then the threshold for using a whole population of these hits that lead to concussions, try to come up with metrics such as the peak acceleration, linear acceleration, the amount peak rotational acceleration that should be tolerated in order to so the concussions will have had some acceleration associated with the impact, and by accumulating a whole bunch of data, you can try to identify what the lowest threshold of linear acceleration, rotational acceleration, and various combinations of those metrics are that lead to a concussion, and then demand that the helmets prevent that threshold at certain drop heights. So you would say, for example, that if and so that's what's complicated is taking a drop height, for example, here, correlating this with a specific injury. So this kind of drop height is coming from history. Usually car crash were the first to do this kind of thing. Maybe you put the rails horizontally, and in military circumstances, these linear testing of these helmets, this kind of testing evolved from the particular impacts, as I say, from the football. It's tricky to that, but these are all sort of very empirically based thresholds, and they're all based on clinically determined measures of injury. Typically, what happens when the helmet comes to an impact, or when a head comes to an impact, is that there's some acceleration goes from zero before it hits, and then it rises up, reaches a peak, and then it decays as the impact is over. And the two principles, the tissue and heads can have a force for a short time, so a peak force for a short time and a lower force over a longer time. There's some combination of those two. So a lower force over a longer time can cause damage. A peak force over a short time can cause damage, but a lower force can be tolerated over a longer time generally. And there are some quantitative metrics that have been used to try to empirically come up with some kind of metric criteria for this. So this is a little bit messy, but this shows the idea. So above these curves, this is a curve. Here's time, here's peak acceleration, and this is linear acceleration only. Above these curves, this is deemed to be one threshold metric. So this metric here was determined in a very crude way. It was using scaled monkey data from car crash industry, where they would actually concuss monkeys and then try to scale the size of the head form up to humans, and then you would establish this kind of 30% concussion risk, and then it's empirically connected with some clinical measures in other circumstances, such as football and such, and military circumstances where concussions had been where impacts had been recreated, et cetera, et cetera. The thing is that, so this shows that the tolerance level is higher accelerations for shorter time. That's the principle here. There are lower accelerations, longer time duration of the impact, but lower accelerations can be tolerated for longer times. The thing is that much of the data, much of these metrics, which has been used to inform helmets of all different industries, are really too lax. The NFL concussions have been found to show up at much lower level of thresholds than what traditional impact studies had produced for a while. And this is an example of something that's fairly recently, within the past 10, even 15 years, this threshold for linear acceleration has had to be lowered. And even this is just linear acceleration. So this is just concussion. So way below here, which is not shown and doesn't exist for any helmet standard, would be some level of acceleration for CTE. So if you had, say, 100 hits at 20 Gs, that may be a precursor to CTE. That's way below the radar of any of the tests that are any of these metrics. So this is just to say quickly here, the National Highway Transport Safety Standards traditionally have been for fracture and serious TBI. They do have some metric that includes rotational acceleration, but these are very not very strong. They're very lenient. A better standard for motorcycles and such is and motor vehicles, but motorcycles is this European standard. But again, I looked at the numbers. It's again very it's not very stringent. But in these cases, you're looking not so much at repeated impacts, but you're looking at a single event kind of impact. There is a bike standard in Europe that demands a certain threshold for peak accelerations, and I think this is also, the standard is also generally insufficient. That doesn't mean there exist helmets that do much better than this, but the minimum standard is I think insufficient. So the National Operating Committee on Sports and Athletic Equipment has used this threshold. Now there's a rotational threshold. This is also, I think, insufficient, but this rotational threshold corresponds to a tangential acceleration from rotation of 50 times g. So you divide this number by 100, and it shows that 50 g's rather than, say, a number like 200 starts to become important for when you include rotational acceleration here. Now the military helmets also, the accelerations are traditionally based on linear acceleration, and the standards are really not very good. But most importantly, for military helmets, blast exposure is a completely different thing. Hopefully I'll get to explaining that. So no standards for CTI or blast specifically, lenient standards for concussions in most helmets. The metrics don't account for head versus body mass. That's another thing. So the testing is usually based, with a fixed head and head form. So this has an 11.8 kilogram drop assembly. But if you imagine you fall completely vertically, then there are different, the acceleration and the injury thresholds would be different if the body mass is included in this rather than just kind of the head form mass. And that's kind of a bit of a complicated circumstance at the moment. And the standards really are not yet rigorously connected to brain tissue damage. So how much stress does it take? When you have an external force, what's the actual stress that it incurs on various parts of the brain in the actual tissue? There's lots of work on that academically, but there hasn't been really a clear transition between that academic work and the helmet kind of standards, which is the kind of thing that you really need for this. Now, also, physics thinking in this respect is kind of interesting. You could ask about woodpeckers. They have huge acceleration. So peak acceleration, as I described, is one of the metrics. But they have, and this head injury criteria takes into account the duration of the acceleration, and these humans are getting severe TBI when this number is more like 1,000 than 300,000. And so when you if you use the metrics that are commonly used for helmets for humans, woodpeckers would be, would seem to be very injured. But basically, it's a very simple reason that woodpeckers aren't getting these injuries, and that is that the acceleration-based thresholds in the which pervade the industry are always because of the fixed mass of the human head form. And so that drops out as a variable, but woodpeckers have a tiny head mass, and force is mass times acceleration. So they can tolerate much higher accelerations than the human. So on the similar plot that I showed before, the woodpecker threshold would scale way up here. This is where measured accelerations in woodpeckers are, and human tolerance curve would be down here. So the woodpeckers also have less sloshing between their brain and their skull, which is spongy. They have a tongue that wraps around the skull, provides some extra stability, and very little rotational acceleration when observed. They have a very linear acceleration. So they likely have features that protect both concussions and the repetitive subconcussive long-term injury. Now, helmet pads I mentioned are important, and so this is just a study that we did some time ago to look at different helmet pads in military applications, but it applies to any. And basically, what helmets need to do, you need if the helmet is too squishy, then it'll compress all the way down to the bottom and it'll stop protecting. If the helmet is too rigid, it won't compress enough. So there's a kind of Goldilocks for a given applied impact velocity that gives you the lowest amount of force into the head body and most absorbed into the cushion. And that's something that's a subtle thing. In the context of the military, we found a very simple problem that they had either the pads were too hard or the pads were too soft. But we found that overall a simple solution for mitigating the problem that we identified there was just to actually use a larger size helmet, double the padding layer of a specific type, and you could reduce the factor of 20, the reduction in serious injury from a 1 meter fall. So I kind of mentioned this because this was a very large reduction in predicted injury just by, say, doubling the thickness of your pads, if in this sort of circumstance. So another study that's relevant here is trying to use brain imaging to identify what the most effective metric is for identifying injury. So the way this was done, and I was involved in this particular study, accelerometers were put into the University of Rochester football players' helmets, measured linear acceleration, rotational acceleration, etc. The data over the course of the season was accumulated, and we tried to identify what the best metric was that correlated with brain scans. The players were scanned at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season, and then again 6 months later. And then there was a control group that was also scanned at the same intervals that were not playing football. And we found the best correlation with brain injury, with brain changes in the magnetic resonance imaging were found to be rotational acceleration threshold above this particular number. So that was another important clue about rotational acceleration being quite important. The changes that you see in MRI imaging are basically a measure of how fluid flows, and basically the images indicate more disordered tissue. So a kind of more isotropic flow of the in this case it's like CSF, it's basically water flow in the brain, and as the tissue is damaged, it becomes more random. So tissues that should be ordered and striated and have a certain anisotropy to the flow, if they're repeatedly damaged, the isotropy increases, and that's kind of the nature of the changes that were observed. And so over the courses, so this is an example of an athlete that compared to a control, green indicates a lot of changes compared to the original scan before the season. So this was the kind of thing that this study was sort of trying to combine physical and clinical metrics. And by the way, there were over the course of a season, the mechanical data were triggered on these accelerometers that triggered above 10 Gs, 10 Gs of accelerate, 10 times gravity accelerations. And the linemen, and U of R is just a Division III football team, the linemen had over 2,000 hits in the season. So 2,000 hits over, actually it was 20 Gs. So 2,000 hits over 20 Gs in the course of a single season. So, over the course of a life of football, that's a lot of impacts. And so that's kind of interesting. Now, the last sort of theme, I guess, here, numerically simulating impacts. So a lot of the experiments that have begun to try to test helmet and protection and try to, even clinical symptoms are based on actual experiments or actual clinical circumstances. But an important way to move forward is numerical simulations. And there's been, so with high fidelity modeling of brain set up in a computer, these are very high fidelity kind of modeling. You have to put in the properties of the various tissues and such. You can subject in the simulation forces onto the head form and then look where the stresses appear in the tissue, in the actual tissue. So that's one avenue of research that is aimed at kind of correlating how an external force correlates with particular tissue response. And there have been some metrics of this sort from these simulations. So, for example, the maximum stress at the upper brainstem, where the brain is connecting to the spine, was a strong correlator with NFL concussions. There are like presently around 11 of these very high fidelity head model groups doing these kinds of head model and research, and it's a kind of an active thing. But you don't always need high fidelity simulations to understand some basic principles. For example, the difference between two helmets, you can understand whether, a simple model of the brain, you have two helmets, you simulate the different helmets, and then whether the same stress on the exterior by the same, for example, impact, you can measure whether the stress in the interior is lower or higher for two different helmets, and that doesn't require necessarily. So comparative studies are often very useful and don't require always the same high fidelity detailed modeling. And finally, let me just, I guess, just talk about this one thing, which is a simulation. And along these lines, this is an example of a very assume the cow is a sphere kind of approach, which is that take a simple model. So here's a simple model of a skull, not a high fidelity model. And this is just a shell, cerebral spinal fluid, and then brain tissue in the interior. So, and then you can compare, for example, how blast injury on this structure would be different from an impact injury, and look at what goes on in the interior. So that's something that a very simple model like this can do. This is also a simple model of a head form here. So one of the things that you can find is that an impact, you can look at various quantities. You take your helmet, take an impact here. Say the impact is over here on this side. So here's the impact side. You can see that peak pressures measured in these simulations here and here, that's this coup and counter coup locations of contusion. You can look at measures of shear strain in the tissue from the impact. You see that it occurs maximum at various specific locations for this geometry, and pressure gradients, for example, different metrics that are connected with specific types of injury to specific tissue in the head model. So this is a way that one can look at very much cheaper than experiments, and give some insight into understanding, exactly where in the brain various types of impact and subconcussive injury or stresses are being propagated. And finally, for blasts here, this is a simulation of a kind of blast explosion. So this is sort of an IED level explosion. It gives you 1 bar of overpressure. A blast wave is just a high pressure wave that propagates out, a high pressure wave that propagates across from an explosion that propagates across the skull. The thickness of the blast wave is very, very thin, and it's much smaller than the diameter of the skull, and so it produces a 1 bar of overpressure, so it doubles the ambient pressure at the skull for this particular type of explosion that we are looking at here. And then you can look at, sorry, I lost my, there we go. So you can look at comparing the impact versus blast wave. So look at, for example, the pressure and impact, high pressure here, low pressure here upon impact as the brain is pushed forward, and this is receded from this edge here. The blast wave is very thin, propagating across the skull, produces these ripples in the skull, which leads to a very different pattern of pressure. So the injury is very different. It turns out, for example, that the blast wave would only accelerate, the blast wave that gives you a 1 atmosphere overpressure accelerates this head form only up to maybe 50 or 60 Gs in linear acceleration, but it produces very high pressure extremes in particular locations as the skull is actually undulated by the pressure wave that drives stress waves into the tissue, and those converge at various locations and cause very high localized points of injury. So it's a very different mechanisms that are going on when a blast wave propagates across the skull than when an impact. And so the principle here, you would like a rigid shell so that it avoids this undulation like this. So you have competing effects, rigidity versus absorption from impact, and particularly in military helmets where that combination is happening together. You could be exposed to a blast wave inside of a vehicle and then be crashing up against the wall of the vehicle if you're not strapped in, for example, or just be knocked down on the ground. So you incur both the blast kind of injury, and then you might hit your head subsequently. So you'd like protection against, both of those two things, which the principles of those different types of injuries can be identified by this kind of analysis, which is much cheaper to do numerically, computationally much better, much cheaper than physical experiments on all of these things. So yeah, anyway, that's
I have
finally.
a couple of questions before. Are you almost finished? Shall we let you
Yeah,
finish?
And
Go ahead.
yeah, and then just one other thing about the helmets, we for blast waves, the cushioning. If you have a helmet with no cushioning, the blast wave can get up underneath the helmet and actually is worse than no helmet. So you need to fill that space between the skull and the helmet with cushioning. So that's another principle that you can learn from these basic kind of types of submissions. Yeah. So anyway, I'll just a lot of evolution needed in these in helmet design. And the insidious thing is the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, damage from repeated impacts. And really from blast waves, there's no specific injury metric. And so, yeah, so those are the basic, and ideally we'd like to have better in vivo biomarkers for low-level TBI, but this is not something this is also active research, but yeah, so that's the bottom line. Sorry. Good.
Point of feel. Okay. A couple of questions. Let's start out with, and then we'll see whether anybody wants to add to them. But Tom Jones, you have a question about differences in level of sports? Unmute if you can, if you haven't. Yeah, here, Tom's question is there any good data revealing any differences in brain energy level for NSF versus Division I football? In other words, when it goes up, does the range of
Yes.
go up?
Yes. So the thresholds, yeah, so it's the uh, the way it goes is that the accelerations, for example, are the the injury. So in NFL, the concussions. So the concussions are as the level goes up, the concussions
Yeah.
go up, but it's the thing is that the hits are harder in general. The hits are harder at the higher levels, but there's also, for example, the neck strengths and such have also been deemed uh, uh, um, higher as well. So the thresholds for injury uh, are debated in that respect. So at the higher level, is, for example, the threshold of injury higher, and the hit level is also higher. At the lower level, the impact is lower, but the tolerance may also be lower for the overall body surrounding support of the head, for example. So that's for concussions in particular. So the concussions do go up. They go up with level, but the CTE, the damage from repeated subconcussive blows, that is not clear because the a lot of the youth, you can only really, that's only really been identified when the in deceased brains. I mean, the dominant. So the players have to die to see that. And so, but in young players, even the image that I showed was from an 18-year-old. So it does seem like it's prevalent. Uh, it's prevalent even at the youth level. However, of course, if you played youth football and you play college football, then you play pro football, you've had a long history of those impacts over a lifetime. So it's probably the CTE will be worse, not just because of the level, but because of the accumulated history.
Okay. Deborah Chung, you have a question? Would you like to ask? Unmute, please.
Yes, actually, I typed it onto the chat. Has anybody used 3D printing to fabricate a helmet with tailored gradation of the stiffness as well as a tailored gradation of the energy dissipation ability?
Yes, I'm not aware of specifically helmet that has been 3D printed in that way completely. I think some of the foams that go into the helmets, but not necessarily the whole helmet. But I don't think that's the standard. That's not the standard. It is something that should be really done. The key, I guess, is, identifying. I mean, the 3D printing of it is the manufacturing of it is certainly important, and I guess what exactly, how exactly to design is, goes into, is where all of the some sense of physics is. um but indeed, so for example, you'd like cushioning that. I mean, you could imagine, for example, two layers of cushioning for high velocity and for low velocity impacts, or have a gradient, as you sort of described in cushioning, where you have the density of the foam that deviates from very high density to low density, and then different parts of the foam are relevant for different velocity impacts. Um, so that the design of that uh, is super important. The manufacturing of it, once it's designed, also would be a great, innovation to have that, printed up, so yeah, both of those things. I mean, I think it's an excellent point. I don't think it's the standard, and it maybe should be ultimately for, producing these.
Okay. Okay. Azit, you have a question about using finite element analysis?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your fantastic talk. We briefly touched upon numerical analysis for modeling the performance of these helmets. I was curious if finite element analysis is used or any other methodology that could be superior or FEA. Thank you.
Yes, yes, it's a lot of it is finite. There is finite element analysis used in these simulations. Um, the those are the dominant, probably the dominant adaptive mesh refinement. So these are uh, um, uh, where you have these, finite element, and then you can, depending on the resolution that you want, you can tune the resolution to different regions differently. But in these cases, you set up a mesh, as you see, you set up a mesh with different density of the elements essentially throughout the volume, and you can tune that resolution for to what you want. So you can make the, I mean, yeah, you can make the resolution fixed grid, or you can make it adaptive, so that during compression, for example, you increase the number of elements in the region where you want higher resolution, and you don't waste that resolution in areas of the brain during impact, for example, that are not as compressed or stressed. In this set of simulations, the ones this code that, for example, the blast code where you have a blast wave and so that involves both fluid dynamics at the exterior and involves solid structures. This code is called AL. The code that's widely one used is come from like the national labs, where the bomb codes, which are used to understand building collapse under the influence of blast waves, have been adapted to blast waves interacting with biological systems, or blast waves interacting here with the head form. This is called ALE 3D code, and it's a Eulerian Lagrangian finite element code.
And both of these models can handle rotational forces as well?
Oh, yes, yes,
Okay, thank you.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to skip over. Jim, I'll get back to you in a second. Mike Delucci, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. It seems like one of the key insights that was that rotational stresses cause the image at much lower stress levels. And you mentioned briefly MIPS, which I've heard about. The bike helmet people talk about it a lot. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is and how it works?
Oh, the so right. So this well, sorry, this is the, yeah, so this, I think I showed, did I show, let's see.
You mentioned it briefly, so maybe it's not. You just,
Yeah, no, this one here. So yeah, this is the idea here, is that you have the shell, which is out here. And so this is the outer shell, and then inner here is a head form that's attached to that is separated. So there's this inner yellow thing is separated in such a way that when you hit the outer shell, it can move. It can move. It's not these two things that can move relative to one another. And the idea is that you're absorbing some of that rotational energy for an oblique impact, that's not that in the actual motion of this outer component relative to the inner component. So, the standard traditional helmets have the inner component with all the cushioning and everything in the inside fully attached to the outer shell. In this case, you're at impact, this, as it's shown, the outer shell moves where the yellow part remains fixed. So see here, the endpoint of this is flush with the yellow here, but here at impact, the outer shell has moved and the yellow part has remained fixed at this location. And this is an example of one way of separating the outer shell from the inner, and not necessarily the only way. Other examples. So this is shown in a football helmet you see here. I think they do also make other helmets, and maybe it's caught on more in some of the other wide diversity of helmets. But the other way of doing this, another way of doing this, is to have like a elastic connection between here and here, uh, and so that has a certain anisotropic property where, like, it compresses in one direction fairly rigidly, but its shear is a little bit looser, so it's a little bit more easier to shear. And that's been another. I think there was another helmet that I may have dropped it out of my. There was another helmet that I didn't. I dropped it out. There is a helmet that had that principle. It didn't somehow the NFL didn't select it. So the NFL has solicits designs and invests in some new models and such. That particular the designer of the other one with this with that had as I described had sent me his thing some time ago. I thought it was going to be competitive, but it didn't seem to make the final threshold. So again, but yeah, this is all principles. Some of this is marketing and such. I mean, there's a lot of room to different ways of doing this, different ways of decoupling the shell from the inner region, and those will be probably in the future more standardized, hopefully.
Yeah. Eric, that was the claim to fame. That rotation of the cells is the claim to fame on the shell and the helmet that I was wearing that
Okay,
saved me.
that
It's
had it.
supposed to
Oh,
twist.
excellent.
It's called
Excellent.
wave cell for what it's worth.
Excellent.
Jim, you had a question, and I think it's probably almost time to wrap up. So why don't you ask your question, and then we'll take it from there. Jim Boyd.
Yeah, Eric, I may have misunderstood, but 15 minutes ago, I thought you had a slide that showed that the thickness of the internal padding was significant, and if you doubled the size of that pad, you could reduce uh,
Yeah.
concussion
Yeah.
rates by like 20x.
Right. So this. So
And
right.
and so my question is, so why don't we just do that? Like, why
Right.
doesn't
So
the
yeah. No,
NFL just mandate that? And now we're in a much better place.
exactly. So the thing is that the this particular statement, this particular thing emerged from a specific study of military helmet pads that were in existing use. Uh, and the point is that it for the pads in existing use, uh, we did find that this was the best solution based on the way those specific pads compress, uh, give and for an estimate of the type of expected impacts and such. One would have to look. So indeed, the point of that was to say, look how crude this a simple solution could be for these military helmets. You don't have to do much, just do this. Get a bigger size helmet, and you'd get this effect. So indeed, in that context, that was our conclusion. I can't say for sure that for football helmets that this conclusion would also apply. It depends on the specific foam, and it depends on so it has to be tested for a separate, the particular foam that's being used for a given football helmet. But the football helmets are doing a better job already of protecting against concussions than the military helmets that we tested were doing. So the football helmets in that context, may have already, at least for concussions, and concussions are not even quite the dominant problem as much now. It's really the subconcussive injury, and that we don't that more work is needed to be done because there's not a clear threshold. So those are low acceleration impacts, not high acceleration impacts. And so there it becomes a little bit questionable. So So this was a crude solution in the specific context of the military helmets. Uh, uh, but yes, I mean, it's possible that crude solutions like this for other components of these injuries do exist. It's still of order, a kind of first principle kind of thing that's still active in this way. So yes, but that I can't say for sure without looking at the specific foam in a given helmet that this would apply in all cases.